of the murders. It's your family or me.
There's never been any doubt about that. This video is going to tell you about how it all went down, the details and the facts.
Woman who had an affair with Chris Watts told our partners at the Denver Post that she hardly knew anything about Shanann and that she had only recently started a relationship with Chris. Well, there's now evidence to suggest that she knew about Shanann almost a year before the murders.
Nicole later talked to police.
And then one day he told me that he had 2 kids. I was like, that's pretty cool. And started telling me about his kids.
That sounded like a sarcastic comment.
No, I thought it was kind of cute. I was like, oh, he's a dad. It was like right around Father's Day, too.
She learned he was married even though she says he didn't wear a wedding ring.
I'm so out of breath.
The other woman claims she met Watts in June. She says she thought Watts was at the end of his divorce proceedings.
I didn't know his significant other's name for a while. And then I think he told me his kids' names pretty quick.
This one is Chris Watts. Chris Watts.
But police had found her internet searches from the year before. Kessinger searched the name Shanann Watts in September of 2017.
I didn't know his significant other's name for a while.
Am I in trouble because I related to sex?
You're not in trouble. Is it criminal? No.
Well, in Colorado, destruction of evidence is a felony.
Is there concern that you're hiding something? Potentially.
You know, I'm worried about people. They're so little. And she's pregnant. Oh, and it's like, where's their mom?
Say hi. Say hi. Cece likes the camera. Say hi, Cece. Say hi. Hi. She loves the camera. I don't know if you guys saw her. And then there's Bella. Say hi. I was in a really bad mood. And I got a friend request from Chris on Facebook. And I was like, oh, what the heck. I'm never going to meet him. Except.
I'm having a wonderful time. You mean a lot to me. And I'm glad that you're having a blast. I am so out of breath.
He's the best thing that has ever happened to me.
Nicole Kessinger turned out to have information that I can best describe as being a bombshell.
Hi. There you go.
This is the part 2 of a series that takes a look at Nicole Kessinger's possible involvement in a crime that took the lives of pregnant Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts in 2018. In the latter part of this video, we will dive deep into the timeline and take a look at what Nicole Kessinger actually did, her actions and her interactions with Chris Watts in the weeks and the days leading up to the murders. Before that, we will continue to explore what law enforcement knew about Nicole Kessinger's guilty knowledge or actions as it relates to this crime. The kind of information this channel has recently obtained about this crime that is exclusive. This part 2 has been separated into 2 parts. So this is the first part of part 2. The second part is forthcoming up soon.
Honestly, like I try to picture that whole ride, like it's like 45 minutes to an hour ride out there. And it's just like, couldn't I have like saved my girl's life? Couldn't I have done something? Why did I do that? I don't know.
Right.
Like this is my flesh and blood. This is like what I wanted all my life, was to be a dad, just to have, you know, kids, and they love me, they, you know, all that, and it just nothing made sense.
I mean, I can do that. I don't mind giving you guys my time. I just need you guys to like help me with my employer and try to just help me brace for this immediate thing.
Even though I didn't know them, it's very surreal. They lived in this town. I guarantee I passed them at the grocery store, you know. I know people who know them. I always think of The Last Daughter. I wonder what they saw. I think about the last one and how afraid she must have been. And God bless their souls.
What we're looking at here is some of the actual footage from the drive from Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado to Survey 319. Every time I see this, every single time, I think about Bella and I try to make myself imagine what it was she was feeling on this ride. And every single time it reminds me without any doubt that justice is worth pursuing, even if it takes a long time and even if there are some kind of shady stops along the way.
For that night?
On Saturday?
Yeah, his kid. Well, you know his kids are with the babysitter. Do you know where his wife is?
She's in Arizona.
Okay. How do you know that?
Because he told me.
Okay. You know what she's doing there?
I think she's on a business trip. He didn't even tell me right away. He actually told me, I think, like on Saturday or something. It might have been like Friday or something. I honestly don't remember. I just remember I was like really surprised where he's like, hey, like, I'm going to try to get a babysitter if you want to hang out or something like that. And I was like, why do you need a babysitter? Like, your wife's home. He's like, no, she's out of town. I was like, oh.
Okay. Is there much conversation regarding that, her on being on a trip, or the children on during those conversations?
Not really. I just asked him what time she was coming home on Sunday, and he just said really late.
Okay.
And that was it. I mean, there's nothing really to talk about with that.
I want you to remember what Nicole Kessinger said right here. We are going to return to this later in this video and take a look at her body language when he asked if they talked about Shanann or the girls.
Is there much conversation regarding that, her on being on a trip, or the children on during those conversations?
Not really. I just asked him what time she was coming home on Sunday, and he just said really late.
Okay.
And that was it. I mean, there's nothing really to talk about with that.
Okay. During those conversations?
Not really. I just asked him what time she was coming home on Sunday, and he just said really late.
Okay.
And that was it. I mean, there's nothing really to talk about with that.
Okay.
Before moving forward into the part 2 content of this video series, let's first do a recap of what was discussed in part 1. The most important question that we asked, and we're hoping could possibly be answered, can be bounced over to District Attorney Rourke. Hey Rourke, what's up with this statement?
Nicole Kessinger turned out to have information that I can best describe as being a bombshell.
District Attorney Rourke, I call your bluff. So we established through a conversation between Kevin Kobach and Stacey Galbraith and CBI's Tammy Lee that Nicole Kessinger was not, in fact, an eyewitness. That was not the bombshell evidence.
I had to write a letter yesterday for Weld County to approve, to pay for her treatment.
Oh.
And then it's got to go through a board because it's kind of unusual.
Yeah.
Since she's not an eyewitness.
So we did learn that part of Nicole Kessinger's victim package that she received from the state was free therapy for victims of crimes. And I didn't even need to tell you this. The discovery makes it pretty clear, but it was on the first day that the FBI interviewed Nicole Kessinger, 2 days after the murders of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico, did the FBI declare that she would be protected. Her identity would be protected. She was a protected witness. It's right here. Before interviewing her, before interrogating her, before checking out her alibi or vetting her, the FBI declared her protected from day one. In addition to District Attorney Rourke declaring that Nicole Kessinger had what he could best describe as being bombshell evidence, he also described how she came to law enforcement and what it was she had to offer. We found this to be really curious because what he said does not align with any of the facts as we well know them to be.
Law enforcement got a phone call from a woman named Nicole Kessinger She said that she had information and was offering to be interviewed as part of this investigation to offer up to investigators what she knew.
But of course, District Attorney Rourke, that silly guy, he doesn't always tell it exactly like it is. So it's more like this. Nicole Kessinger came forward because Ann Darko's Tony Husky, the supervisor for the division that she and Chris Watts worked for, found emails between Nicole Kessinger and Chris Watts from June 12th, 2018, that indicated to him that they might have a little romance brewing. When she found that out, of course she had to go to law enforcement because they were going to come to her if she didn't get to them first. And she certainly didn't share with law enforcement what she knew, just like that, easy breezy, because over the course of the several hours, almost 10 hours that law enforcement interviewed Nicole Kessinger, she changed her story on every material fact or point several times. And also, as we know, she deleted everything, all correspondence and anything having to do with herself and Chris Watts from her cell phone. And she also tried to bust her SIM card. So no, District Attorney Rourke, Nicole Kessinger was not forthcoming. Let's just be clear about that.
What did that cause you to do with your phone, though?
Oh, what? When I deleted those? I was just kind of grossed out by him, to be honest with you. I removed it.
So you you already said, but you removed text messages?
I deleted all of his stuff. It was the hurt that made me delete it. And then it was the lie that made me start questioning everything else he'd been telling me for the last few days.
And that's when you decided to come forward?
Yeah.
She was interviewed on multiple occasions. I believe that for the most part she was forthcoming in the course of those investigations.
This man, this district attorney, this champion of justice is clearly all over the place. He changes his story nearly as much as Nicole Kessinger does, and we have to ask why that is. Well, in the part one, we went over all of the things that District Attorney Rourke knew during the time of this investigation about Nicole Kessinger and everything else. We went over things that he knew when he decided, oh, it is time to accept Chris Watts' plea deal and just get this whole thing over with. And the things that he knew raise some serious questions. Let's do a summary of the part one because all of this information is critical. Number one, Kessinger was treated as a witness from day one. Number two, the FBI protected her from day one. Number three, Rourke mischaracterized her reason for coming forward. Number four, Rourke over-exaggerated the value of her statements in helping the investigation and ultimately solving this crime. Number five, Rourke said himself that she hampered the investigation and that she was forthcoming for the most part. And finally, Rourke was aware of incriminating evidence that would show that Nicole Kessinger had guilty knowledge of this horrible crime and possibly more. Rourke was also aware of how the evidence in this case was handled, what evidence was collected, how it was processed, if it was processed or analyzed at all. He also was aware of the direction the investigation was heading in had he not accepted the plea deal from Chris Watts. We are left with these central questions. Why did District Attorney Rourke accept a plea deal from Chris Watts, putting no conditions whatsoever on that plea deal? Why did District Attorney Rourke and law enforcement protect Nicole Kessinger? Why was there a need to protect Chris Watts' mistress, and how did protecting her benefit law enforcement or District Attorney's office? Since we know by Nicole Kessinger's own admission and District Attorney Rourke's statements, she did in fact break laws. She deleted evidence, she destroyed evidence, she obstructed justice. What was the full extent of her knowledge or involvement before, during, or after these horrific crimes? And since we know that she did commit offenses, why were serious, chargeable offenses completely ignored? Here's where things get tricky. To answer all of those questions, especially together, you can't really find an answer that makes sense. You can come up with things like, well, obviously people didn't really want to know what happened. People didn't want to know if there was more than one person involved in this horrible crime. Or they just didn't really care to know the whole story at all. They figured, no one was really going to be interested. The families weren't going to care. The lives didn't matter. So they just weren't really going to look into it too deeply, right? And that doesn't make any sense. That's absurd, right? If you've been following this case at all, it's likely that you've heard Tammy Lee's statement about, we had so much more work to do. It felt so weird.
We didn't examine all the evidence. We didn't interview every witness we needed to. We didn't do all of these things that you would do in a normal investigation because he stopped the clock.
Case of a missing mother and her 2 young daughters. Their father pleading for their safe return, but this morning, he's the one in custody.
And all of a sudden, I receive a phone call from Detective Bombshell, and he said, hey, Chris is going to plead guilty to all charges.
Christopher Watts has pleaded guilty to killing his pregnant wife, Shanann, and 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, and their unborn son, Nico.
Whoa, wait, we're not done. We have all these things to do. We were relieved that it was going to be over, but at the same time, we felt like, in a sense, we didn't finish.
As Tammy Lee said, Chris Watts,
he stopped the clock.
In saying that Chris Watts' plea stopped the clock, that implies that prior to the clock stopping, prior to the plea, the investigation was being handled with great curiosity, vigor, and a sense of justice. And my friends, that was not the case at all. I am going to lay out the facts and the timeline for you right here and right now, so any confusion can be lifted and we can all be clear on the fact that that investigation really stopped more than 2 months before Chris Watts pled. If you're not ready to face that hard truth, I suggest that you pause and gather yourself right now, because I'm about to lay it all out for you real clear.
The only way they could have left is in your truck. The only way they could have left is in your truck.
Nicole Kessinger turned out to have information that I can best describe as being a bombshell.
Initially, you drew concern from me when you told me you deleted everything from Chris. I've already told you that. You understand why. There's no question as to why that might cause concern. So,
okay, my friend. So there you heard Tammy Lee telling Chris Watts that she knows that Bella, Celeste, and his wife Shanann left their home in his work truck and they were missing at the time. And then we have DA Rourke describing the information Nicole Kessinger gave law enforcement as being bombshell. And then we have CBI's agent Kevin Kobach talking to Miss Kessinger and saying, initially you drew concern for me when you deleted all of your text messages between yourself and Chris Watts, and there's no question as to why that is. The investigators and the prosecution have given us some key facts about this case, things that they know for certain. Number one, they know that Chris Watts' family, who is missing, left the house in his work truck. We also know that Miss Kessinger is a big part of this investigation, according to DA Rourke, bombshell information. And then we have the multiple interviews with Nicole Kessinger and Kevin Kobach in which she repeatedly lies about why she deleted her messages, the text messages between herself and Chris Watts, and any information that relates to Chris Watts on her phone. They also know that Chris Watts' work truck played a pivotal part in this crime. And these investigators, they don't really know what part she may have played leading up to, during the murders, or in the attempted cover-up of the murders. Since the original recording of this Part 2 material, we have learned a lot about what the investigators actually knew about Nicole Kessinger's involvement, and you will learn that too. One unknown is about Nicole Kessinger's role in this crime, in the planning of the crime, in the execution of the crime, or the cover-up of the crime. Based on evidence that was collected In the days following the murders from Chris Watts' work truck, they know that when that evidence is analyzed, it's going to be very telling. Chris Watts' work truck was a central focus from the very beginning. Check out this broadcast here. It was breaking news in the 10 o'clock news on August 16th, 2018, the same day that Chris Watts supposedly confessed. Reporters were standing outside of the house, and they were reporting on Chris Watts' work truck being towed and evidence being taken from that work truck. This was in hours and days after the murders happened. They had the evidence. They had the evidence that would have started to answer the questions regarding Nicole Kessinger's role in this crime due to her proximity to the crime scene, as of course Chris Watts' work truck was part of the crime scene.
Hi, I am live right now outside the home of Chris Watts and Shanann Watts, and you can see behind me police are here right now processing the evidence inside the home. Denver 7's Jace Larson was able to confirm through sources that Chris Watts has confessed to killing his pregnant wife and their two little girls, Bella and Celeste. And we know that right now police are digging up the bodies, that they know where the bodies are and that they are looking for them right now. So right now police have been towing a truck that was parked just a couple of houses down. We didn't know it was connected to the house, but they towed that as well. And they just came out with the family's dog in a cage as well. So they also went in there with evidence bags, and they showed up right around 10 o'clock, right when we were working on the newscast.
Chris Watts' work truck that fateful evening, or rather the early morning hours of August 13th, 2018. It's almost too charmed, isn't it? If you're someone who wants justice for these victims, it is too charmed, because we've already established that it was determined Nicole Kessinger would be protected from day one, literally day one, by the highest law enforcement agency in the United States of America, by the FBI. So that certainly will get in the way of an honest investigation that seeks truth and justice, and we always have to remember that when we're examining this case. The importance of protecting Nicole Kessinger is a sad reality of this case. So let's look at the importance of the evidence in Chris Watts' work truck in another light. It's important in a number of ways. If law enforcement was truly more concerned with protecting Nicole Kessinger at the expense of justice, or even if they didn't care if Kessinger was in that truck with Chris Watts, don't you think that they would want to corroborate his confession and prove scientifically that his confession was true? That the body of his deceased wife and his alive children were in the back of his work truck on that drive from Saratoga Trail to Survey 319? Wouldn't you think they would want to know that if they had the evidence right at their fingertips? Let me read you part of this supplement from the discovery. It should be noted that on September 4th, 2018, while running through the evidence submission list with lab tech Patricia Lopez, several items were listed that CBI Lab ultimately did not wish to take possession of at that time. Those items are crossed out on the evidence submission form, which has been added to the case file. The refused items are as follows. I'm going to read the last three items. Driver's side seat cover from work truck. Trace lift from center console of Chris Watts' work truck. And trace lift from back seat driver side of Chris Watts' work truck. The items that were not taken by CBI are transported back to the Frederick Police Department and checked into evidence. Nothing further. It's so important that we understand the significance of what was done here. The trace lifts that were taken from Chris Watts' work truck for the purpose of determining if any other occupants were in that truck. That evidence was actually collected. But CBI, Colorado Bureau of Investigation, chose to not send that evidence to their labs to analyze the evidence to determine what DNA could be found, what hair could be found, what other evidence, trace evidence could be found that would decisively identify what, if any, occupants were in Chris Watts' work truck, and they could also determine if those occupants were alive or deceased. Now, when I've brought this issue up before, people might refute it by saying, oh, well, you know, maybe, well, hey, right there it says they didn't wish to take it into evidence at that time, so maybe they analyze this evidence another time. But guys, we know that's not the case. Again, I stress the significance of understanding this reality of why we know that that is not the case. Because District Attorney Rourke went with the story that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were all murdered in their home at 2825 Saratoga Trail until Tammy Lee, Dave Baumhover, and Graham Coder went to interview Chris Watts in prison after he was already serving his 5 consecutive life sentences on February 18th, 2018, over 3 months after his sentencing. At that time, Chris Watts then gave them a more complete confession, informing them of what apparently really happened, that Shanann's life was taken at the home, and that sweet little Bella and Celeste made that car ride from Saratoga Trail to Survey 319, 45 minutes, alive, with their mother's body on the floorboard beneath their feet. And it wasn't until they arrived at Survey 319 did they take their last breaths.
The defendant then methodically and calmly loaded their bodies into his work truck, not in a hasty or disorganized way. He was seen from the neighbor's doorbell camera backing his truck into the driveway, going back and forth into the house and back out to the truck 3 different times, 1 time for each of their bodies. He then drove them away from their family home 1 final time, intent on hiding any evidence of the crimes that he had just committed.
People who were involved in law enforcement, and they believe that this trace lift in DNA evidence would have determined if Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were in fact in that truck, if Nicole Kessinger or any other party was in fact in that truck, and if those occupants were in fact alive or deceased. Determining that is of course important for the sake of justice on its own, but it also has importance regarding more far-reaching consequences of the way that this case, in my opinion, was improperly investigated and prosecuted, and we will discuss those during the course of this video. I will come back to this. So the question remains, why did CBI choose to not analyze this critical evidence that had already been collected? Now, just to be clear on the timeline, it was on September 4th of 2018 that CBI refused to analyze that evidence that had already been collected from Chris Watts' work truck. This is just a few weeks after the murders occurred, and it's more than 2 months before Chris Watts struck a plea deal on November 6th, 2018, and it's about 2.5 months before Chris Watts was sentenced. So to say that the investigative clock stopped when Chris Watts pled on November 6th, 2018, it's just a lie. It's a misrepresentation. This evidence is critical evidence that would have revealed so much was refused for analysis on September 4th, 2 months before the plea deal. Former Morris County, New Jersey prosecutor Bob Bianchi comments on the Watts case. This is from 2018, right after Chris Watts was sentenced. And listen to what he has to say very carefully.
I do want to bring in Bob Bianchi, former prosecutor, host of Law and Crime. So this reminds me a little bit of Ted Bundy when his mom refused to believe that her son would do such a thing. Chris Watts' mom, Bob, is saying this didn't happen. He was coerced. What's your take?
Well, I mean, it's not unusual that a family member looks at somebody that they love. It does a really horrible thing. As a homicide prosecutor for many years, most of the families are in complete disbelief with regard to the fact that somebody they love committed a murder. So that's not unusual. What I do find to be unusual in this case, Susan, again, going back to my prosecutor days, is that I would have required a proffer session with the defendant where he would have sat down in order to be spared the death penalty. He would have spilled the beans on everything from A to Z. We would have known what the motive is, which we don't know right now. And he would have clearly allocated in court, got up and stated, this is what I did and why I did it. The only way he's going to get out of this, Susan, last point, is a belated assertion of innocence is not a basis to withdraw a plea. However, his lawyers didn't do any psychiatric examinations, and the mother points this out. And that could be a huge deal here because maybe he did go into a rage. Maybe there's an insanity defense or a diminished capacity defense that takes it out of murder and makes it a non-death penalty case. That would be the only sliver of a basis that he could withdraw this plea.
Well, Jean Casares touched on this, and she said that in court they did ask him, and his statement was read saying that, yes, he admits to all of this, but the motive was not found. And I wonder if it would ever suffice, whatever motive he may have made up or done, because I can't seem to find a logical one for any of this.
Yeah, well, you rarely do in a murder case because a lot of times it's not something that we can understand. And while a prosecutor does not need to prove motive in any case, you certainly want that. In other words, to protect the file, to protect the belated assertion of innocence, I would have said to the defense attorneys, and they may have done this, but I would have demanded you come in, go fall on your sword, tell us everything A to Z so I can eliminate all these defenses of insanity, passion provocation, diminished capacity. So this way it's locked up in a box so that if you come after the plea to say, hey, I no longer want to take the deal, which happens all the time, you will not be able to get out of it because we have a very specific statement about the reasons why you did it, and we eliminated all the defenses. That did not occur here.
Bob Bianchi, thank you. Maybe it's his parents' way of kind of coping or wrapping their head around this. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
The following is from an interview with District Attorney Rourke right after Chris Watts' sentencing. This interview is filled with examples of what he did, accepting, so to speak, Chris Watts' plea deal was total BS.
I know this is hypothetical, but had Chris Watts not confessed in this case, how tight was this case? I mean, was there a lot of evidence out there? Because I know that as far as the murders, there wasn't a lot.
There was a lot of circumstantial evidence that really, I think, was strong evidence. When law enforcement shows up right at the outset, based on this call from her friend Nicole, saying, I need you to come check on the welfare of Shanann. When her car is there, her purse is there, her cell phone is there, the house is locked up from the inside in a way that no one could lock a door and run out a garage door, for example. No one could lock a door and run out a garage door, for example. The key code on the garage door didn't work. There was no way for a stranger to get in there, abduct them or anything else. Signal to us that it probably, at that early stage, probably was a family member, probably was the defendant. But then you start to really look at the manner in which they were killed, where their bodies were dumped, his familiarity with that area, and I think there were a lot of pieces that could be put together even without him talking, but it certainly made it a much stronger case because he ultimately did give us at least a version of what he wanted us to believe.
Wait, what? Could you please say that again?
Because he ultimately did give us at least a version of what he wanted us to believe.
Yo, did you just say that his confession was helpful because ultimately he gave you a version of what he wanted you to believe? How is that helpful? He gave you, law enforcement, a version of what he wanted you to believe. And he didn't want you to believe he was a bad guy. So he gave you a version of this atrocity that it wasn't even truthful. They had no idea what actually happened to Shanann, Bella, or Cece at the time of Chris Watts' plea. And until at least those 3 investigators went to Dodge Correctional Facility in February of 2019 to basically do some of the investigation that was never done under this man's watch.
Without him talking, but it certainly made it a much stronger case because he ultimately did give us at least a version of what he wanted us to believe, even though we know all of it wasn't the truth.
I'm sorry. What the district attorney said right here is an absolute joke. He says that his confession was helpful because Chris Watts gave law enforcement a version of what Chris Watts wants law enforcement to believe is true. And then he follows it up with, although that we know that most of that even wasn't the truth. I mean, what did he actually say there? It's just word salad to obfuscate and confuse people so they're not looking at the real issues. I'm sure of that.
Do you think he's a psychopath or sociopath? And I don't know if he was actually examined and diagnosed at any point.
If he was, I don't know. Obviously, I don't have the ability to ask for that. From a clinical standpoint, I don't know. There is certainly something wrong with a guy who annihilates his family for a new love affair. There's something wrong with him. Again, from a clinical or insanity standpoint, certainly not. There were no signs of that at all. But how do you do this?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've been a part of several big cases, but is this one at the top of your list in terms of what you'll remember?
I know. Let me answer this one. It certainly is at the top of his cases that the public will remember, that the world will remember, which makes it very important, of course, that he is triumphant in this case, as any district attorney would want to be. But I think that is only part of this DA's alleged reasoning for not properly prosecuting this horrible crime. That's how I feel about it, at least. Just 2 more things about what was said just in this portion of this interview. The interview is longer than what I'm sharing with you right here. But one of the most ironic things about what is discussed here is that District Attorney Rourke wouldn't know the answer to the primary question the interviewer has.
I mean, was there a lot of evidence out there? Because I know that as far as the murders, there wasn't a lot.
And the reason he would not know if there was a lot of evidence is because, as I pointed out earlier in this video, evidence that was collected was not properly analyzed by law enforcement. And this refusal to properly analyze evidence that was collected happened far before the plea deal was struck. Also importantly, that evidence would have told investigators if anybody else was a passenger in the car with him. But since that evidence that was collected was never analyzed and nobody knows where it is now, we might never definitively know the answers to the questions that analyzing that evidence that was already collected would have provided for us. The answers to so many questions were right within our reach, within the investigators' reach. Again, you have to ask, why was this evidence that was collected never analyzed? What would an analysis of that evidence have told investigators and the world? And is that information that somebody didn't want the world to know? I'm just asking. What do you think? Just as I was finishing up this part 2 of this little video series, Law and Crime Network came out with breaking news about Chris Watts. Although we here at Watts the Obsession know that that is actually old news, I'm including here because I think it is going to bring this topic full circle. Listen to what Law and Crime Network had to say.
Since he went to prison in 2018, Nicole Kessinger has basically dropped off the map, preferring to avoid the public eye. Not surprising there. Police have never said that Kessinger had any knowledge about Watts' crimes. However, now it seems Chris Watts may be placing the blame on Kessinger for what happened. Because in recently published notes from Watts' cell out in Wisconsin, he was moved there, we've learned he labels Nicole Kessinger a Jezebel who destroyed his life. Watts evidently writes letters to God as a form of journaling. In one of those pages from 2020, he writes, "Dear Heavenly Father, I have backslidden. I am like a sheep gone astray from the flock and have fallen into a pit. The snare of the enemy has entrapped me. The words of a harlot have brought me low." Now, Dylan Tallman was in the cell next to Chris Watts for around a year. He was locked up on drug possession charges, and he told the Daily Mail that he and Watts became friends and studied the Bible together. The two apparently even planned to write a book together. But when Watts backed out of that deal, apparently, Tallman instead turned the writings into a series of his own books called The Cell Next Door. According to Tallman, Watts told him that Kessinger gave him an ultimatum on the night of the murders. It's your family or me.
Was there an ultimatum? Absolutely, there was. So, as we start to take a look at exactly what happened in the days, in the weeks, and the hours that preceded this horrible tragedy that annihilated Chris Watts' beautiful family, let's take a look at the timeline that led up to August 13th, the day of the murders. On August 7th, 2018, the Watts family altogether flies home to Colorado from North Carolina.
Ready? Set. Hold on.
It is on the next day, August 8th, that Watts deletes his Facebook account. It is also on that next day, August 8th, that Nicole Kessinger makes a Google search, "marrying your mistress." This day was significant to Shanann Watts for different reasons. This is a day when they were scheduled to go to the ultrasound where they would find out the gender of the baby. Now, this day ranges in experience so greatly between Chris Watts and Shanann Watts. I'm just going to go through all of the items on the timeline. At 7:24 a.m., Sarah Nudd, who's a friend of Shanann, asked Shanann if they were doing any better. Shanann replied, "No, it's so bad and I don't know what to do. He told me he doesn't want this baby and he's happy with just Bella and Celeste. He thought he wanted another one. I'm so sick to my stomach. Tried to have sex with him last night just to see if that would help him and he rejected me." Shanann said she hasn't cried this hard ever. Shanann added, "He said he feels like there's a lack of communication and it's not for me. I sent him 12 texts over the month begging him to talk to me. He fell asleep at 7 or 8. Shanann told Sarah, "I tried talking to him after rejection last night and me crying for an hour alone on the couch. He slept. I kicked his sorry ass out of the bed and I refuse to sleep on the couch anymore this week. Told him this morning not to come home today, and if he can't tell me the damn truth and what is wrong." Shanann continued, "We are supposed to go to the ultrasound tonight, and he doesn't even want the baby. He'd abort it if I said it was okay." At 8:06 a.m., Shanann told Sarah he said he's not having an affair. Sarah asked if Shanann was certain of this, of him having an affair, and Shanann replied, "Honestly, no, but what else would make him do a complete 360? We couldn't get enough of each other before I left." At 8:52, Josh Rosenberg, Cassie's husband, asked Chris Watts if he's excited for the ultrasound. "Today's the day, right?" Watts replied he just returned to work and added, "Yep, today's the day. I'm excited." Watts confirmed that the ultrasound was at 7 p.m. At 3:11, Watts made an unspecified modification to Shanann's contact information in his work phone. Now, it should be noted that this is right around the time that he would get out of work, and he did end up going to the ultrasound, but he was hung out with Nicole Kessinger after work and stayed with her right up until the moment that he had to leave for the ultrasound. At 19:25, this would have been shortly after Chris Watts left her apartment, Kessinger searched Google on topics related to marrying your mistress, as I had just earlier mentioned. That was the day. So that is going on while Chris Watts is at the ultrasound appointment with Shanann to find out the gender of the baby. Well, they weren't going to find it out yet. Someone else was finding out. It was Nicole Atkinson. It was going to be put in an envelope, remember? And they were going to have that gender reveal party. So this next item on the timeline would happen after Shanann and Chris went to that ultrasound. So this is how things went there for poor Shanann. So at 9:54, Shanann told Uthoff and Cassie Rosenberg, he said that we are not compatible anymore. He refused to hug me. Jesus. Said he thought another baby would fix things. He said he refused couples counseling. Shanann elaborated. He said a lot of time to reflect on his feelings, Shanann added. He said he's going to work it out, but she didn't know how or when he would agree to counseling. Her friends offered support and suggestions to work this out. At 9:57, Josh begged Watts, bro, I'm waiting patiently. LOL, don't leave me hanging. Watts replied, LOL, envelope is sealed until next weekend. Josh asked if they were going to hold a reveal, and Watts said yes. At 10:19, Shanann told Uthoff and Cassie, I will fight for full custody. Shanann said Watts told her he does not want to divorce right away. So whatever's going on there at that house that night, there's a lot of back and forth between Shanann and Chris that we will never know about. We will never know those details, but it's clear that there were very confused feelings, I guess, on Chris Watts' part, and definitely he was sending Shanann Watts mixed messages. And also I want you to note the hour here. They've usually gone to bed by then. I mean, this is like late for them to be having phone activity. Well, unless it was Chris with Nicole Kessinger, which was out of the norm. At 10:40, Shanann told the women, I can't afford 3 kids alone in Colorado. Shanann said their current home loan is on Chris's name. Her friends rallied around Shanann. At 11:08, so this is getting really late, Shanann searched Google on topics like emotion-focused therapy and couples therapy. So she's still hanging in there looking for an answer to their problems. So remember, this is the same day, the day that they were going to the ultrasound, where the baby's gender was going to be found out and sealed for their gender reveal party. Also on that day, Chris Watts deleted his Facebook account, very curious. And Nicole Kessinger, while Watts was at the ultrasound after he left her place, was searching for marrying your mistress. Now, what does that tell us? At this time, she still knew that she was the mistress. So now we're going to move on to August 9th. A lot of people have gotten the details for this day for ironing out the timeline a little wrong, and that's because there are some incorrect notations in the discovery, like Watts took off from work that day because Shanann was flying to Arizona. That didn't really happen until the next day. So I'm just going to go through the basics of what was going on that day to straighten things out, to just give you the vibe of this all-important week, the week that they returned home, the Watts family returned home from North Carolina. At 2:54, so that's 2:54 a.m. So this Shanann's up in the middle of the night, obviously thinking about a lot of things. And it says, Shanann told Addie that Watts refuses to hold her. And he has told Shanann it's because he's not there. He can't. Shanann also told Addie, I canceled the gender reveal. Nikki is going to tell me today. I need happy news right now. I said to him, how is this a few months? We are so intimate and what I thought was in love when I left. He said he had a lot of time to think. Addie asked Shanann if Shanann has gone through Watts' phone, asking if he was having an affair. Shanann replied, I did. He denied. No, I didn't look. He's deleting messages from his dad, and I'm sure he's not that stupid. Addie noted, none of this makes sense. It's not Chris. Then it's noted, frequently throughout the day, Shanann searched the internet for couples counselors. She also accepted a prayer chain focused on their relationship. Poor Shanann. Jeez, it's 6:09 a.m. Shanann asked Watts, do you want to find out together with me tonight our baby's gender? His reply is not found in his phone. It only exists in Shanann's phone. He started erasing things from his phone that were from Shanann, like almost completely during this week. We wonder why is that. So after she sent Chris that message, he said yes, and then Shanann loved, put a heart on the yes. At 9:20 a.m., a log entry appears for the secret calculator in Watt's phone. At 10:06, Shanann shared an ultrasound image of her newborn son with Sarah Nudd. So the day after the ultrasound, that was a very chaotic day as far as, the different things that were happening for Shanann and Chris. She woke up in the morning. It looks like she barely slept, thinking about this baby and how she could keep her family together. Now we're going to move on to August 10th, but I just want to note that they got home from North Carolina on August 7th, and Shanann left for Arizona in the early morning hours of August 10th, meaning that Shanann was only home for like 2 and a fraction of a day the entire time that Nicole Kessinger and Chris Watts apparently were dating. It seems that Nicole Kessinger had absolutely no tolerance for this, and we have to consider that Shanann's presence in Colorado during the time she was dating Chris, the man she was so possessive of, when the woman she was so jealous of was in town, it had a serious impact on her. Well, we know it did now, and she would go to extreme lengths to not feel that discomfort of Shanann being around her husband while Nicole Kessinger was trying to have a relationship with him. It's also very petty and selfish, and it is such a shame that these 3 beautiful souls and baby Nico lost their lives because of these horrible, ugly human feelings that Nicole Kessinger held in her heart and held in her mind. In my opinion, let's return to the timeline. Then in the early morning hours of August 10th, that Shanann flies to Arizona. Her friend Nicole Atkinson picks her up early in the morning. They travel to the airport together, and they fly out to Arizona for their Lavelle Thrive business trip or getaway. You'll soon understand why it's significant to note that it is also on this day that Shanann mentions for the first time that we know of from the discovery the idea of moving to the realtor Ann Meadows. And this is just because she and Chris had discussed that their finances were out of control and they might have to move out of the house at 2825 Saratoga Trail. It is on Saturday, the 11th, that Chris Watts and Nicole Kessinger have their date at the Lazy Dog Cafe. It is at this time, and we are going to revisit this, that we learn through the interviews, through what Nicole Kessinger tells Kevin Kobach, that Nicole Kessinger presents Watts with a host of apartments that could be possibilities for he and his girls to move into. It is then on Sunday, the 12th, the day before the murders, that Nicole Kessinger sends texts to her best friend, Charlotte Nelson. And in these texts, for the first and only time, does Nicole Kessinger mention Chris Watts to Charlotte Nelson. So think about this. It's the day before the murders, and 6 weeks after they've been dating, according to them, that Nicole Kessinger finally mentions for the first time Chris Watts, her new love interest, to her best friend, Charlotte Nelson. It is also on Sunday, the 12th, that the 111-minute phone call happens. I made a note here on my timeline that refers to the discovery, and the discovery says, Saturday, August 11th, continued. 4 minutes after Chris Watts leaves Nicole Kessinger's apartment, Nicole Kessinger Google searches the names Shanann Watts, Chris Watts, Ronnie Watts, 2825 Saratoga Trail, and after this timeline event, Nicole Kessinger disappears from the official timeline for 43 hours, not to appear again on that timeline until well after the murders have occurred. On August 14th, the day after the murders, we know, by her own admission, Nicole Kessinger deletes all traces of Chris Watts from her phone. So let's take a much closer look at this accurate timeline.
And then the next day, I don't even know what days these were, sometime when he was out there.
Out there refers to the time when Chris Watts was in North Carolina with his family during the first week of August 2018.
He told me, we're putting the house up for sale as soon as we get back. And I was like, well, that was quick. And he was like, it's her, she's ready to go. And I was like, okay. And so I left it at that.
So the way Nicole Kessinger tells the story to investigators here, it's like, Chris Watts flies out to North Carolina, across the country, to see his wife and his children and their extended family, Chris's family and Shanann's family. And once he arrives out there in North Carolina to see his family, he's like, okay, well, this is done. This, separation that's been lingering for the past 6 weeks, as Kessinger and Watts would tell it with their timeline of when they met in their dating and courtship. That's just kind of been, kind of meandering along. But now that I'm across the country with my family in North Carolina, we've decided that we're going to kick into high gear. As soon as we get back, we're going to put that house up for sale. And she's like, okay, cool. All right, cool. That's what's up.
And then he got back and I started asking him, like, what are you going to do? Because the Colorado housing market is fire and you guys are going to sell this house like real fast. And I'm like, you need to start looking for a new place to live. And I'm like, where do you want to live? And I was really trying to help him out. I'm like, do you want to get a house? Do you want 3 bedrooms? So you have one and each of your girls have one. I'm like, do you want to, like do an apartment? Like, what do you want? Where do you want to live? And it was really exciting. Like, I liked helping him and I just wanted him to like,
This is just one of the many times that Nicole Kessinger mentions how helpful she was in assisting Chris Watts in finding a new apartment after he declared that he and Shanann decided that they were going to move their separation/divorce into high gear. And as soon as they returned home from North Carolina, boom, house was going to go on the market. She was very, very excited, clearly, to help him find a new apartment. But with those of us who have followed this case, what we know is Chris and Shanann didn't really decide that they were going to put their house up on the market while they were in North Carolina, at least not because they were headed for a separation or a divorce. Perhaps they did talk about their finances. In fact, we know that they did, but we know that there was never any discussion of divorce. So where did this all come from anyhow? Could it be the pressure that Nicole Kessinger applied before Chris Watts left for North Carolina? Let's revisit that.
Well, the second time I went to that house, I'm not sure what day it was, but it was the weekend of the 14th. We had went out and we stopped there just real quick on the way back. That time I saw a picture of his wife and one of his kids. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, she's so beautiful. And I took a step back and I was just like, why would he want to leave this? And I remember talking to him about it. And that was the first time that I tried to actually say, what do you think about not separating from your wife? I was trying to push him to do it. And he seemed pretty reluctant to do it. He didn't want to. I kind of backed away so we weren't hanging out quite as much, and we were still close, but it was just I really wanted him to try.
When listening to what Nicole Kessinger has to say in these interviews, it's very important to apply context. What was said in the next breath after, the statement that you're currently focusing on, and what was said previous to whatever story Kessinger is telling. This context frames everything and gives her words actual meaning. So first, let's listen to what was said in her next breath. What were those words that followed I really wanted him to try, in reference to his relationship with Shanann.
But it was just like I really wanted him to try.
And then in her very next breath, Nicole Kessinger says,
Like I wanted to know that he tried and it didn't work.
Kessinger has a way of revealing herself. She says, I really wanted him to try. I really wanted him to try and then to know it didn't work. So then read, I can have that certainty in my relationship with him and move from position number 2, mistress, into position number 1.
Like he tried and it didn't work, and then he moved on.
Wow, what Miss Kessinger wanted out of that whole situation was very specific. I wanted to know that he tried and it didn't work, and so then he moved on. And this is much different than what she presents at first to the investigator, saying, you know, oh, I saw this picture of Shanann and one of the girls, and I was like, oh, she's so beautiful. You have this beautiful life. I really just want you to try to salvage your relationship because it's a beautiful thing. I want you to try. No, she wants him to try and fail, so she knows unequivocally that he is all hers, all empanadas, without any interference from the wife. So let's just go back a little and listen to what was being discussed in that room before Nicole Kessinger even brought up what happened on July 14th, which, by the way, was a pivotal day in Chris and Nicole Kessinger's relationship. I suggest you watch the video that's in the cards right now. I'll link it in the description box. What was going on in that room that caused her to fess up, so to speak, about going to the Watts house on July 14th and seeing a photo of Shanann? She doesn't give up anything for free.
Like it's happening. It's going to happen.
Well, the text reiterate what you've been saying all along, so it's not like...
Well, they do. That's the other thing, too. I mean, that's kind of a good backup. Yeah, I'll give
I
it
think
to him.
you hit the nail right on the head. There's reasons why we want everything. It validates things that we know. I'm not going to come out and tell you that if you tell me something today, we'll validate it with your text messages, whether it's the ones we have now or the ones you're going to give us.
I'll give
Certainly.
it to him. If you want to go get him.
I want you to read this, is what I want you to do before you decide that, okay?
So the second time I went to that house, I'm not sure what day it was, but it was the weekend of the 14th.
It's happening. They are asking for her phone records, and they are making her well aware that they are going to be looking at her phone records and utilizing her phone records, whether they did or not. In reality, who knows at this point? But she's like, oh, it's happening. She had previously told law enforcement she'd only been to Chris Watts' house once. So now that it's put in her immediate awareness that law enforcement is going to know where she was on what date, she probably decides, well, this is probably a good opportunity to fess up, kind of, because I'm still going to tell a whole lot of lies.
I don't know. This is what he told me he wanted. So I was like, well, I will help you do the research. But another thing that I really took care of was to be like, where is she moving to? I was never like, you know what, screw your wife, try to get full custody. None of that bullshit. It was always just like, you know, I'd ask him, I'm like, well, what kind of custody are you guys going to have? Because he at work, they're about to switch his schedule. So right now he's like a Monday through Friday, and they're about to switch these guys to 8 days on, 6 days off.
That's tough.
That's awesome. And I was asking him, I was like, are you going to have your kids like on that set of days off? I was like, because that would work perfect. Like 1 week on, 1 week off. And I was just like, you know, we just talk about it. I'm like, what is your plan? And he's like, we haven't figured out exactly what we're going to do about the kids yet. But he told me, he's like, Colorado's a 50-50 state and she's okay with everything 50-50. Like he said that she was like on board with this because she wanted it too. Like she was checked out of this relationship.
We know a lot of what was said by Nicole Kessinger there was untruthful. And now, before we listen to this next excerpt of what she had to say in the same interview, let's just remember this timeline. The Watts family returned home from North Carolina on August 7th. Their lives were all taken by early morning of the 13th. And Shanann was only home from late in the day on the 7th, the 8th and the 9th. She left for Arizona early morning on the 10th. And this is what Nicole Kessinger has to say about interacting with Watts relative to his family being around or not. And I think this is very telling. What do you think?
Because, like, he could pretty much call me whenever he wanted. Like, I was the one that would tell him, like, hey, when your kids are awake, you need to spend time with your kids. Like, do that. And then after they go to bed, like, if you want to talk to me, you can talk to me. But it was never, like, this super, super restricted thing. Like, sometimes, like, right after work, if I was, like, still talking to him, I'd get kind of bummed out. And I tell him, just like, oh, it's frustrating sometimes, like, having to, like, wait. But at the same time, I was never like, this is horrible, or, it was always like, I understood why. But then once his kids were asleep, he never, like, had any, it was like he could do what he wanted. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Sure.
He was in his basement, and she's upstairs, and they're not speaking.
My friends, I would like to propose that what Nicole Kessinger is talking about there is trying to control Chris Watts in areas of their relationship where she feels frustrated. Remember, they have a whole 5 or more weeks of their relationship together with his family across the country. Now, the family's coming back on the 7th. I'm sure this was causing her a great deal of anxiety. We know it was. We see indicators of that. And she wanted to be in control of as much as she could. You know what, Chris? When your kids are around, you can hang out with them, okay? I don't even want to hear from you. Don't need to hear about it. You're with your kids. You're with your kids. Capiche? And then when you're not with them, then you can be with me, but only when you are not with them, right? I first got this idea listening to The Deception Detective, and I think he is so spot on. Every time I listen to it now, that really is all I can hear. But the main thing I want to point out about that excerpt is she tells investigators, when I would get frustrated because, I couldn't see him or talk to him right after work, I just tell him, yeah, it's frustrating, but, like, I understand. My gosh, his children were only home in Colorado with him for a few days, and Shanann was only there for 2.5 days, and I would like to propose that the time that his family was home, this was so frustrating and unacceptable to her that she became absolutely unbearable and demanded that things needed to change. In fact, we know that something like this is the case due to what the Channel's investigation just learned about what investigators knew about Nicole Kessinger and some part she played in the nefarious activities that happened in the days leading up to the end of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste's life. And we will be going deeper into that in the next 2 episodes of this series. In this Dr. Phil episode, we're about to explore a little bit. It was recorded right after Chris Watts' final confession to the 3 investigators when they went out to speak with him in Dodge Correctional Facility after he had already been charged, sentenced, and was no doubt spending the rest of his life in prison. Dr. Phil, in this clip, talks to Shanann's family's attorneys. He brings up the topic saying, we know that the other person in the investigation that was questioned was the mistress. Did anything actually come of that investigation? In talking to the mistress. We will then hear what the attorneys had to say, and guys, it is very interesting. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but wow, wait until you hear this now.
Chris Watts is sharing new details about the night he killed them. An attorney for Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandy Rusick, told our Dylan Thomas his clients were briefed on the new information and were evaluating their next steps.
We need to pay attention to the fact that they say here that the family was evaluating their next steps. Dr. Phil asked the attorneys why investigators went to talk to Chris Watts in February of 2019.
As we've expressed, it's our guess
that there was another person they were looking into or investigating that would have required enough time to either determine if charges should be brought or if that was not an avenue to be explored. And we're unsure at this point if that's ongoing investigation or not, so we don't want to go too far down that road.
The Rourke's family attorneys offer an explanation of why the Rourkes may simply not care if law enforcement goes after someone else that may have been involved. I mean, think of Chris Watts' initial confession. He blamed Shanann for these atrocities. He blamed Shanann. The Rourke's family's main concern was to clear Shanann's name, and rightfully so. They probably felt after that happened they could move on. The result of that interview in February 2019 from Dodge Correctional Facility is that Shanann's name was, in fact, cleared. The family attorneys say that with this confession, they hope that it can be known by all that Chris Watts did not walk in to find his daughter's lives being taken by the hands of Shanann. The attorney goes on to say, and man, I can totally understand this, and I so much feel for Sandy Rourke and the Rourke family, that the way the information is coming out now, rather than in a prolonged way as it would in a trial when they had time to emotionally prepare for what they were going to hear, there's information coming out every 2 to 3 weeks, and it's making Sandy feel kind of angry, and my gosh, who could blame the woman? It's torture. The attorney then goes on to explain how the Rourkes went about making the decision that they did regarding the outcome they'd feel okay with there being a trial or not being a trial, accepting Chris Watts' plea or not, and having death penalty on the table or not. And remember, the information that they were given from District Attorney Rourke upon which they made that decision was information that District Attorney Rourke himself was not even certain of, because they never analyzed the evidence that was found in the investigation. So the story that they based that decision on was that pregnant Shanann, Bella, and Celeste's lives all ended in the home, and then Chris Watts loaded each of them into the truck deceased, drove them to Survey 319, where he disposed of their bodies. But that is not what really happened.
That the family made the choice, whether you believe it's the correct one or not, to not pursue the death penalty. If it were me, I don't know how that would sit with me, knowing that she didn't know the full story.
And that might very well have changed the position she took, what she advocated for at the time.
All I can tell you is what I might do. It would definitely have changed the calculus
Well, isn't that
for
some
me.
egg in District Attorney Rourke's face? District Attorney Rourke relayed information to Shanann Watts' family based on an incomplete investigation, an investigation that he knew was incomplete, an investigation where evidence that was collected was not even analyzed. And based on that information, he asked Shanann Watts' family to make probably the biggest decision of their life so far. He stayed in their home for 3 days. After he found out some information that I talked about in the part 1 of this series, that Michael Prill indicated in his report in the discovery before the timeline, that not all of the material was found in Chris Watts' phone. In fact, he came across items from the secret calculator app, as he says, just as a result of curiosity. He says that the forensic lab didn't have whatever was needed to access those inner storage vaults of an iPhone. And now that he knows that there was a secret calculator app, that there are places within that phone that might exist content that is relevant to the investigation. His plan was, as he outlined in the discovery report, to obtain another search warrant that would soon be executed and the investigation would continue on. The report was dated October 30th, 2018. Straight away, District Attorney Rourke and Steve Wren got on a plane to go to North Carolina to spend 3 days with the Rourke family. Upon their return, on November 6, 2018, they struck a plea deal with Chris Watts. Isn't that interesting timing? We are going to tie all of the pieces together, what has been discussed in part 1, and this part of part 2, coming up very soon in the continuation of part 2. And when we conclude, we will be able to share with you the information that we learned as a result of this channel's investigation just last week. Thank you so much for being patient, for caring about justice for these victims and for us all. Please leave a comment below and let us know what you think. We will find justice for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico.